The tax crisis that ends every empire, the final stage. It is November of 301 AD, and the Emperor Diocletian stands in Rome with a scroll in his hands. The scroll contains his edict on maximum prices, a desperate command that fixes the cost of bread, wine, oil, and labor across the entire empire. The reason is neither mystery nor temporary. The denarius, the silver coin that has been the lifeblood of Roman commerce for 3 centuries, has become nearly worthless. What once contained nearly pure silver now contains less than 5%. Merchants refuse to accept it at face value. Soldiers demand payment in goods, not coin. Diocletian's response is not to restore the coin, he lacks the tax base to do so, but to use force to freeze prices in place, hoping to hide the collapse beneath a legal fiction. Within months, the law fails. Black markets explode. Production halts. The empire does not know it yet, but it is reading its own epitaph. This is not a story unique to Rome. This moment, when an empire discovers that its currency has died and its tax system can no longer pay its bills, has arrived on the same stage again and again across 15 centuries. The Ottoman Empire faced it in the 17th century. The Spanish crown faced it in the 16th. The British Empire faced it in the 20th. And the pattern beneath each collapse is not one of accident, bad luck, or the rise of a rival power. It is mechanical. It is fiscal. It is written in the ledger before it appears in the streets. By the end of this essay, you will understand the repeating tax crisis that marks the final stage of every empire, how a shrinking population of taxpayers, escalating military costs, and the accelerating brutality of collection drive confidence in the currency towards zero, and why no amount of force can stop it once it begins. The empire does not die because it is defeated. It dies because it can no longer afford to exist. To understand this final stage, we must first see the machinery that precedes it. Every empire that has ever expanded beyond a small city-state has faced the same fiscal question: how do you pay for an army spread across vast territory, defending borders that grow more expensive to hold every year, while collecting taxes from a population that would rather hide its wealth than contribute to the state? For a time, sometimes for centuries, the answer appears to work. Rome in the 2nd century AD under the Antonines was that rare imperial moment, a surplus. Taxes were collected in silver. The currency was stable. Soldiers were paid in real money. Infrastructure was built. The state appeared to be in harmony with its fiscal reality. But the nature of empires is expansion, and expansion requires debt. The 3rd century brought plague, border wars, and internal civil war. Military spending soared. Tax collection became sporadic. The state made a choice that every empire eventually makes: it did not reduce spending. It devalued the currency. A silver coin that is clipped thin, mixed with cheaper metals, or simply stamped with higher value than its material worth is invisible theft, but it is theft that happens all at once across the entire empire. No one needs to approve it. No vote is required. The emperor simply orders the mint to produce more coins of lower purity, spending them as if they were full value. For a few years, this works. The state pays its bills. Soldiers receive their coins. Prices appear stable because the debasement is recent and the markets have not yet adjusted their expectations. But markets adjust faster than governments admit. By 265 AD, the denarius had lost so much silver content that merchants began to reject it in private transactions. By 280 AD, taxes themselves had to be collected partly in goods rather than coin, a sign that the state no longer trusted its own money. By 301 AD, Diocletian's price controls were an open acknowledgement that the currency was dead and force was all that remained. This is the moment that we must learn to recognize, because it appears in every imperial collapse. It is not the moment of military defeat. It is the moment when the tax base, the foundation of all state power, begins to collapse under its own weight. Consider the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century. By 1640, the Ottoman military, the Janissaries, had begun to riot over delayed pay. The silver content of the Ottoman axe had been debased repeatedly. The empire had fought 3 expensive wars against Persia, Venice, and various European powers. Tax collection in the periphery had become nearly impossible, not because the state was weak militarily, but because the collectors themselves had turned to banditry, taking far more from the peasantry than was owed to Istanbul, keeping the difference, and leaving little incentive for honest reporting. The state responded with what all empires in this stage respond with: escalating brutality. Tax collectors were replaced by new tax collectors, who were more aggressive. Penalties for non-payment increased. Soldiers were sent to extract grain and goods directly from villages. And with each increase in pressure, the tax base shrank further. Peasants abandoned fields. Merchants moved to less taxed territories. The money that did arrive was worth less because the currency was debased. The janissaries rioted more often. And the empire, which had been one of the most powerful military machines ever built, began a slow dissolution that would take another 3 centuries to complete. The mechanism is now visible. It works like a borrowed candle that is burning from both ends. On one end, military costs rise because the borders are expensive and the threats are real, or at least, they appear that way to the ruling power. On the other end, the tax base shrinks because the state has begun to devalue the currency in order to pay those military costs without raising taxes directly. The candle burns down from both ends simultaneously. The state cannot stop spending without appearing weak. It cannot stop devaluing the currency without admitting that it has no money. So it does the only thing that appears available: it squeezes harder. But here is the mechanism that breaks the empire's will: as the state squeezes harder, the taxpayers flee. They move to other territories. They stop reporting honest production. They hide wealth. They bribe officials to lower their assessments. They move into cities where tax collectors cannot reach them. And they begin to refuse the state's currency in favor of foreign coins, barter, or hoarded precious metals. The tax base, which appeared to be a fixed resource that could simply be taxed more efficiently, reveals itself to be elastic. It can shrink. And once it begins to shrink, the state has entered what economists call the tax death spiral. Consider the Spanish Empire in the 16th century. Spain had discovered vast deposits of silver in the New World, the Potosi mine and others. This silver flooded into Europe, and for a moment it appeared that Spain had solved the problem of imperial finance, unlimited precious metal. The Spanish crown used this silver to finance wars across Europe, to build palaces, to maintain the largest navy in the world. But the influx of silver caused prices to rise across the entire Spanish economy and across Europe. A unit of Spanish silver was worth less in 1600 than it had been in 1550, even though the mines were more productive. The state responded by spending even more silver to maintain the same military power. Tax revenues from Spain itself were insufficient, so the crown borrowed from Genoese bankers and Flemish merchants. By 1575, Spain faced such severe debt that it defaulted on its obligations. It did not lose wars. It simply ran out of money to pay for them. This is the point we must understand clearly: empires do not collapse because they are conquered. They collapse because they exhaust the tax base that finances their survival. And by the time the tax base is exhausted, force, which is the only tool remaining to the state, only accelerates the collapse. Which empire do you think we are most like right now? Not in terms of geography or military power, but in terms of the tax base and the currency. Tell me below. Now, let us correct a false belief that emerges at this point in every imperial decline. Every empire in this stage believes something that is demonstrably false, and this false belief is perhaps the most reliable warning sign that collapse is approaching. The belief is this: we are the exception. Our situation is different. Our currency is backed by the faith of our people, and that faith will not break as long as we remain strong militarily. Rome believed this in 300 AD. The Ottoman Empire believed this in 1650. The Spanish crown believed this in 1575. And the belief is understandable, it is comforting, but it is always wrong. The currency is not backed by military power. It is backed by the rational expectation that the state will be able to pay its debts and maintain a stable value over time. Once that expectation is broken, once the taxpayers understand that the state will devalue the currency rather than reduce spending, the belief collapses. And belief is the only thing that backs the currency once military power is insufficient to collect taxes. A sword cannot force a merchant to accept a worthless coin. A soldier cannot consume a debased denarius for nourishment. The state discovers, too late, that all its power rests on a foundation of voluntary compliance with the tax system and voluntary acceptance of the currency. And that foundation, once cracked, can be reinforced only by restoring stability, not by increasing pressure. The warning signs are these, and they appear in this order. First, the tax base begins to report less income, not because production has fallen but because reporting has become dishonest and collection has become brutal. Second, the state begins to use increasingly harsh methods to extract taxes, methods that alienate the taxpayers rather than encourage compliance. Third, the currency begins to be rejected in private transactions in favor of foreign currencies or precious metals hoarded at home. Fourth, the military becomes restless over pay because the currency in which they are paid is losing value. Fifth, the state responds to this restlessness by either devaluing the currency further or by forcing payment in goods rather than coin, which signals openly that the coin is dead. And finally, the tax base collapses entirely, not because the people are conquered, but because they have withdrawn their cooperation from the fiscal system. This final stage is marked by a transformation in the nature of the state's power. The state that once commanded through law now commands through force alone. The state that once collected taxes in currency now collects them in goods or through direct seizure. The state that once existed in a relationship of mutual obligation with its subjects now exists in a relationship of pure extraction. And at this point, the state has entered the final chapter of its decline. The British Empire faced this same mechanism in the 20th century. After World War II, the pound sterling had been severely weakened by the costs of war. American dollars had accumulated in the hands of foreign creditors. In 1944, the British had negotiated the Bretton Woods system, which fixed the pound to gold and created a system in which the dollar, not the pound, would be the world's reserve currency. Britain, which had been the financial center of the world for a century, was now subordinate to American monetary authority. The tax base that had seemed inexhaustible, the resources of an empire on which the sun never set, proved to be finite. By 1956, when Britain attempted to reassert control over the Suez Canal, it discovered that it no longer had the financial resources to do so. The American government simply refused to support the pound, and the British were forced to withdraw. The empire was not defeated militarily. It was defeated financially. The currency had died, and the imperial tax system had collapsed. History does not repeat in its details. But in its mechanics, it rhymes. The truth that all empires eventually learn, and that all fail to learn until it is too late, is that the ledger is not negotiable. The ledger is not a symbol or a belief system. It is a constraint. A state can appear powerful when it spends more than it collects for a time, because it can borrow against future tax revenues. But eventually, those future revenues do not materialize. The borrowers become skeptical. The creditors demand repayment. And the state is forced to choose between reducing spending and devaluing the currency. If it chooses to devalue the currency, it accelerates the loss of confidence. If it chooses to reduce spending, it appears weak and vulnerable. Either way, the final stage has begun, and it has a momentum that force cannot stop. The patterns are now visible to anyone willing to read them. The tax base is not an infinite resource. The currency is not backed by flags or armies. It is backed by the rational expectation of future stability, and that expectation is fragile. Once it breaks, force can extract some wealth from the population, but it cannot restore confidence. The currency will continue to be rejected. The taxpayers will continue to flee. And the state will continue to descend into a final phase in which it extracts everything it can from a shrinking base until there is nothing left to extract. This is not prophecy. This is pattern recognition. This is mechanics. And the mechanics are older than Rome and will outlast whatever comes next. History does not repeat, but the money rhymes. Subscribe for the patterns that outlast every empire, and tell me below which collapse you want decoded next.